El Mayo says, "I did not turn myself in and I did not come voluntarily to the United States."
If I was a betting man, I'd bet on him getting away and getting away with this. Arriba!
The Mexican government is complicit in these drug cartel organizations.
You'll never believe why El Chapo's son decided to betray El Mayo Zambada, the legendary leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, a man who's evaded capture for over half a century, suddenly finds himself in handcuffs on American soil. But here's where it gets juicy. This wasn't some brilliant DEA operation that finally brought him down. No, it was an inside job from deep within the highest ranks of El Mayo's own cartel. We're talking about a tale of betrayal that goes deeper than anyone could have imagined. El Chapo's own flesh and blood, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, allegedly turning on his father's longtime partner. But why? What could drive someone to betray one of the most powerful figures in the criminal underworld? Was this a calculated move by the younger Guzman, or did he unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that could reshape the entire landscape of the drug trade? This story is about to take us on a wild ride through the shadowy underbelly of the narco world. Imagine it's a warm July morning in 2024, and a sleek private jet is cutting through the clear blue skies over northern Mexico. On board is Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the 76-year-old kingpin of the Sinaloa Cartel. For a man of his age and stature, he looks surprisingly relaxed. Maybe it's because he's managed to stay one step ahead of the law for over half a century. Or perhaps it's because he thinks he's on his way to a routine business meeting. Little does El Mayo know, but this flight is about to become the most important journey of his life, and quite possibly his last as a free man. Sitting across from him is Joaquin Guzman Lopez, known as El Güero, one of the sons of the infamous El Chapo. The younger Guzman is fidgeting slightly, his eyes peeking nervously around the cabin. If El Mayo notices this unusual behavior, he certainly doesn't show it. After all, when you've been in the game as long as he has, you learn to keep your poker face on at all times. As the plane begins its descent, El Mayo stares out the window. The landscape below is familiar, the rugged terrain of Sinaloa, the state that gave birth to one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. For a moment, a slight smile crosses his weathered face. This is his kingdom, the empire he built from the ground up. But that smile is about to be wiped away forever. The plane touches down on a small, nondescript airstrip. El Mayo stands up, straightening his signature cowboy hat, the one that earned him the nickname, the man with the hat. He's expecting to be greeted by some local officials, maybe even the governor of Sinaloa himself. That's what he was told anyway. Instead, as the cabin door swings open, El Mayo is confronted by a sight that makes his blood run cold. Standing on the tarmac is a group of heavily armed men in tactical gear. Their faces are hidden behind masks, but their intentions are crystal clear. In that moment, El Mayo realizes he's been set up. He turns to Guzman Lopez. A look of shock and betrayal can be seen all across his face. But before he can even open his mouth to speak, the armed men are storming the plane. Ismael Zambada Garcia, one of them shouts, "You're under arrest." And just like that, the long reign of El Mayo comes to an abrupt and inglorious end. Now, you might be wondering, how did we get here? How did one of the most cautious and elusive drug lords in history end up walking right into such an obvious trap? Well, to understand that, we need to rewind a bit and dive into the complex world of cartel politics and family loyalties. Let's start with the man behind the legend. El Mayo isn't just any run-of-the-mill drug lord we're talking about. Ismael Zambada Garcia is a legend in the narco world, a man who managed to build and maintain a criminal empire for nearly half a century, virtually undefeated.
Mayo Zambada had been running the cartel for a number of years, and they have a very strong bench, very good leaders.
And not only was El Mayo particularly gifted as a cartel leader, but he was also extremely elusive.
We haven't really had a photo of this guy probably for 25 years.
It's easy to see why most people, including Jack Riley, also known as the former head of the DEA, thought El Mayo could very well evade justice forever.
If I was a betting man, I'd bet on him getting away and getting away with this.
El Mayo was basically the chess master, always thinking 10 moves ahead. But even the greatest chess masters can be outplayed if someone knows their game well enough. And who would know El Mayo's game better than the son of his longtime partner, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman? Now, here's where things get really interesting. Let's rewind, go back in time a bit. The year is 2019, and El Chapo is on trial in New York. During those proceedings, Chapo's defense team made a pretty wild claim. They argued that El Chapo wasn't really the mastermind behind the Sinaloa Cartel. It was El Mayo all along. That's what El Chapo's lawyer reportedly told the court. Now, at the time, most people saw this as a desperate attempt to shift blame. But what if there was more to it? What if this was El Chapo's way of sending a message to his old partner? Fast forward to 2024, and it's El Chapo's son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, who seems to have taken that message to heart. But why would Guzman Lopez turn on El Mayo? What could he possibly gain from betraying one of the most powerful men in the criminal underworld? Well, to understand that, we need to look at the changing dynamics within the Sinaloa Cartel. You see, after El Chapo's arrest and extradition, there was a power struggle brewing. On one side, you had El Mayo and his faction. On the other, you had Los Chapitos, El Chapo's sons, including Guzman Lopez.
El Chapo was basically put out there to have the spotlight so that he could cover for Mayo Zambada. The Chapitos, like their father, they like the glory, they like being glorified in narco corridos, and the spotlight is on them.
That's nothing like El Mayo's low-key approach, and it was causing some serious tension within the cartel. The old guard, represented by El Mayo, was clashing with the new blood of Los Chapitos. But here's where it gets interesting. Taking on El Mayo directly would have meant that both parties would likely perish. After all, the man had connections that ran deep, its loyalty built over decades. So, Guzman Lopez had to be smart about it. And what's smarter than turning your enemy over to the authorities and coming out looking like a hero? But let's get back to that fateful day in July 2024. As El Mayo is being led away in handcuffs, he must have been wondering how it all went so wrong. But the real shocker comes when he realizes that Guzman Lopez, the man who set him up, is being arrested too.
How did the son of an imprisoned drug lord end up on a private plane in El Paso, Texas?
That's the question everyone was asking. And it's where this story takes another twist. Because you see, Guzman Lopez wasn't just turning in El Mayo, he was turning himself in too. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, why would he do that? Why not just let the authorities take El Mayo and walk away scot-free? Well, that's where things get really interesting. Some experts believe that Guzman Lopez was playing an even longer game. You see, by turning himself in along with El Mayo, he might have been hoping to strike a deal with the US authorities. After all, delivering one of the most wanted men in the world to their doorstep has got to be worth something, right?
The fact that they went through the effort of bringing him here to be prosecuted would suggest that Guzman has arranged for or is hoping for some sort of lenient treatment by the U.S. authorities.
In the world of drug cartels, information is power, and Guzman Lopez, as the son of El Chapo and a high-ranking member of the Sinaloa Cartel, would have had access to a treasure trove of extremely valuable intel. But here's where it gets even more complicated. As news of El Mayo's arrest broke, his lawyer came out swinging with some pretty wild accusations. According to him, this was a kidnapping from start to finish.
El Mayo says, I did not turn myself in and I did not come voluntarily to the United States, nor did I have an agreement with either government. To the contrary, I was kidnapped and brought to the US forcefully and against my will.
He also says he was ambushed by a group of men who assaulted him, adding he was subjected to physical abuse and forced into a private plane that came straight to El Paso, where US federal authorities were waiting for him.
That's what El Mayo allegedly told his lawyer. He claims he was ambushed, thrown to the ground, and handcuffed by 6 men from within his own cartel. They allegedly tied his legs, put a black bag over his head, and threw him into the back of a pickup truck before forcing him onto the plane. Now, if any of this is true, it means that there was some serious betrayal within the highest ranks of one of the most powerful cartels the world has ever known. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. The Mexican government is crying foul, saying they were completely in the dark about this operation. They're demanding answers from the U.S. Department of Justice, wanting to know exactly how one of their citizens ended up in American custody without going through proper legal channels.
It appears the Mexican authorities had no role in any of this operation. They have said so publicly, and seem to be scrambling for information about what happened, just like everyone else. You know, the U.S. has worked hand in hand over the years with Mexico, but that relationship has become more difficult over the years.
This lack of cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico is raising some serious questions. If this was a legitimate law enforcement operation, why keep the Mexican authorities out of the loop? And if it wasn't, well, that opens up a whole new can of worms. Some experts are even suggesting that this whole operation might have been part of a larger power play within the Mexican government itself. After all, El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with the governor of Sinaloa, Ruben Rocha Moya, to possibly discuss future operations. If that's true, it suggests a level of high-level cooperation that goes way beyond your typical law enforcement operation, something that a lot of experts have been trying to ring the alarm about for a long time now.
The Mexican government is complicit in these drug cartel organizations, no question about it.
That's a pretty explosive claim, right? But when you consider the level of corruption that's been exposed in Mexican law enforcement and politics over the years, it's not entirely far-fetched. Could it be that certain factions within the Mexican government saw El Mayo as a liability and decided to get rid of him? Or was this a genuine attempt by honest officials to bring down one of the biggest players in the drug trade? The truth is, we may never know the full story, but one thing's for sure, the arrest of Mayo Zambada has opened up a Pandora's box of questions about the relationship between cartels, governments, and law enforcement on both sides of the border. And let's not forget about the potential fallout from this arrest. The Sinaloa Cartel isn't just going to roll over and call it quits now that El Mayo's gone. There are plenty of ambitious underlings ready to step up and claim the throne.
The concern is, however, that when you take out a top kingpin like this, that it creates a power vacuum and that there's fighting to sort of fill that and fill their shoes. We saw that after Chapo's capture.
That's the word coming in from experts, and they're all basically saying the same thing. El Mayo's arrest just means more bad news, and it's not hard to see why they're worried. We could be looking at the beginning of a cartel war that makes previous conflicts look like schoolyard scuffles. But the potential for violence isn't limited to Mexico. The Sinaloa Cartel has tentacles that reach deep into the United States. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and even New York could see an uptick in violence as different factions vie for control of distribution networks.
Now we have open borders, and then despite the most recent executive action, the cartels, the open borders have enabled the cartels to become the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. They are making billions and billions, and the open border did nothing but enable them. And they have infiltrated into the United States even more so than they did before, and there's no way to put this toothpaste back in the tube.
So was this a masterstroke by the DEA, a betrayal from within the cartel, or something even more sinister? And more importantly, what happens next? Now let's dive deeper into the potential consequences of this seismic event in the narco world, because the ripple effects of El Mayo's fall are likely to be felt far beyond the borders of Mexico. First up, let's talk about the power vacuum left in the wake of El Mayo's arrest. In the world of drug cartels, that vacuum tends to get filled pretty quickly and violently. With El Mayo gone, who's going to step up to fill his shoes? Will it be Los Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo, who've been itching to take full control of the cartel? Or will rival organizations see this as their chance to move in on Sinaloa territory? Well, that depends almost entirely on what actually went down on that fateful day of July.
Why prepare? Because it's not clear what happened. There could be a different response from criminal groups if it was a surrender or a betrayal between cells of the same cartel.
One thing's for sure though, the next few months are going to be crucial, and if history has taught us anything, it's that transitions of power in the cartel world are rarely peaceful. We could be looking at a full-blown cartel war that makes previous conflicts look like playground scuffles. Chris Swecker, a former FBI official, gives us a pretty scary prediction of what might be coming. We're not just talking about a temporary spike in violence. This could reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in North America.
Typically, when you make a high-level arrest like this is one of the top leaders of the Sinaloa Cartel, El Chapo's organization. Things tend to get violent, even more violent than they are normally, and violence is the norm in Mexico. So when you take off a top cartel leader, the other leaders start vying for power, rivals start to move in, and it gets extremely bloody.
It's a grim picture, right? But let's circle back to the circumstances of his arrest, because the more we look at it, the more questions we have. If El Mayo really was kidnapped, as he claims, what does that say about the state of law enforcement in Mexico? And what about the US government's role in all this? If they knew El Mayo was brought to the country against his will, does that make them complicit in an international kidnapping? It's a legal and ethical minefield that could have serious repercussions for US-Mexico relations. Speaking of which, let's talk about how this whole affair is playing out on the diplomatic stage. The Mexican government, unsurprisingly, isn't too happy about one of their citizens being snatched up and whipped across the border. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has been demanding full transparency from the US about the operation. And can you blame him? Having one of your country's most notorious criminals snatched from under your nose isn't a great look for any government. It raises some uncomfortable questions about who's really in control south of the border. But here's where it gets really interesting. Some experts are suggesting that elements within the Mexican government might have been in on the plan all along. After all, El Mayo claims he was led to believe he was meeting with a governor. If that's true, it suggests a level of high-level cooperation that goes way beyond your typical law enforcement operation.
When you have those volumes of money that are associated with the drug traffic coming through a relatively, a still developing country like Mexico, it does create enormous distortions in the system. And so, in that sense, a trajectory of escalating violence, increasing corruption, a direct challenge to political authority.
That's just how deep the reach of the cartels is, and it paints a picture of a system where the line between criminal and government official is a lot blurrier than we'd like to think. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture for a moment. The arrest of Mayo Zambada isn't just about one man, it's about the potential fall of an empire. The Sinaloa Cartel, under El Mayo's leadership, was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. We're talking about a group that at its peak was believed to be responsible for smuggling 25% of all illegal drugs entering the US from Mexico. So when a man like this falls, it sends shockwaves through the entire criminal underworld. It's like if Apple suddenly lost its CEO and half its board of directors in one day. You'd expect some pretty major upheaval, right? But here's the thing. Some experts believe that El Mayo's arrest might not change much at all. Why? Because the Sinaloa Cartel isn't just one man or even a group of men. It's a system, a well-oiled machine that's been running for decades.
I don't think that they will have any significant impact on the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel. And as an example, I will give to you exactly what happened when the leader of the Sinaloa Cartel, Chapo Guzman, was extradited to the United States. Had no impact.
So, what we're looking at here is a potential powder keg. Will the Sinaloa Cartel implode in a blaze of internal conflict? Will rival cartels swoop in to claim territory? Or will it be business as usual, with new leaders stepping up to fill El Mayo's shoes? Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, the Mexican drug trade is in for some turbulent times. And as we're about to see, the repercussions of this power struggle could reach far beyond Mexico's borders. And what's even worse is the fact that this situation might spill into the US in ways few could have initially anticipated. The instability in Mexico could lead to an increase in other criminal activities that directly impact the US. We're talking about human trafficking, weapons smuggling, and money laundering on a massive scale. This infiltration isn't just happening in border states. Cartel networks extend deep into the heartland of America. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and even New York could see an uptick in violence as different factions vie for control of distribution networks. But perhaps the most insidious impact is one we can't easily see or measure: the corruption of American institutions. If the cartels are indeed as deeply embedded in the U.S. as some experts fear, we could see attempts to influence local politics, compromise law enforcement, and infiltrate legitimate businesses. It's a threat not just to public safety, but to the very foundations of our democracy. So, what can be done? That's the million-dollar question. Some argue for tighter border security, while others push for drug policy reform. But as long as there's demand for drugs in the U.S., there will be cartels willing to supply them. As we grapple with these challenges, one thing is clear: the fall of Mayo Zambada isn't just a Mexican problem. It's a crisis that could have far-reaching consequences for communities across the United States. And addressing this crisis will require a level of international cooperation that so far has proven elusive. So, where do we go from here? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The challenges ahead are daunting, to say the least. We're looking at the potential for increased violence in Mexico, a flood of drugs into the U.S., and the possibility of cartel influence spreading even further into American institutions. But it's not all doom and gloom. The arrest of Mayo, as fraught with potential consequences as it is, also represents an opportunity. It's a chance to reassess our approach to the war on drugs, to strengthen international cooperation, and to address the root causes of the drug trade. One thing's for sure: the old strategies aren't working. The kingpin approach, where authorities focus on taking down cartel leaders, has been shown time and time again to have limited effectiveness. So, is it time to consider alternative approaches? Should the U.S. be looking at decriminalization or even legalization as a way to take the profit out of the drug trade? It's a controversial idea, to be sure, but with the current strategies failing to make a dent in the problem, it's one that's gaining traction in some circles. And what about addressing the root causes of the drug trade? Poverty, lack of economic opportunities, and weak institutions all contribute to the power of the cartels. Maybe it's time for a Marshall Plan for Mexico and Central America, focusing on economic development and strengthening democratic institutions. Of course, none of these solutions are easy or quick fixes. They require long-term commitment, significant resources, and a level of international cooperation that's often been lacking in the past. But as we've seen with the arrest of Mayo Zambada, the current approach is like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. We're treating the symptoms without addressing the underlying disease. The fall of Mayo Zambada isn't just the end of a kingpin's reign, it's the final curtain on an entire era of the drug trade. But as one chapter closes, another begins, and this one's being written in real time, with ink still wet and the ending far from certain. Will the next act be a bloodbath of cartel violence, or could it be the opening scene of a radical new approach to the war on drugs? As we wrap up, I want you to put yourself in the hot seat for a moment. Imagine you're suddenly in charge of tackling this mess. What's your move? Do you double down on brute force, trying to crush the cartels once and for all? Maybe you'd focus on rooting out corruption, believing that clean governments are the key? Or would you tear up the old playbook entirely, perhaps considering options like decriminalization that were once thought unthinkable? Feel free to share your thoughts down in the comment section below. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, stay safe.